Dad, Daddy. The two little girls in pink dresses whispered the words in unison, their voices trembling as Declan Hayes cradled them in his arms, smoke swirling around them like a closing fist. He just pulled them from the inferno, guided by the sharp bark and fearless charge of his German shepherd, Valor. But those two words sliced deeper than any flame, hitting a place inside the seasoned officer he thought had long since turned to stone. And in that instant, Declan knew this fire was only the beginning. The last light of late autumn in Willow Creek slid low across the river, gilding the water with a burnished glow that made the old buildings along the quay look almost romantic. Declan Hayes had long since stopped noticing such things, but Valor seemed to. The 5-year-old German shepherd trotted half a step ahead on the cracked sidewalk, his black and tan coat catching hints of gold as he moved. Even after all these years, Declan still marveled at how the dog's gait carried that combination of military precision and easy grace trained muscle and unshakable purpose bound in a single frame. He owed that dog more than he cared to admit. 6 months earlier, Valor had taken a bad fall in a search and rescue drill, tearing a tendon in his right hind leg. For a time, Declan thought his partner's working days were over, but Valor had fought his way back through gritted teeth, metaphorically speaking, and today was his first patrol since being cleared for duty. Declan himself was adjusting to a different pace. At 40, with close-cropped, dark blonde hair just starting to silver at the temples, the white police officer had shifted from night shift patrol to a community safety role. It was quieter in theory, fewer foot chases, more neighbor disputes. Still, the part of him trained to notice trouble in the air had never really switched off. His jaw was square, the lines at the corners of his eyes carved by years of squinting into weather and light. The set of his shoulders told the world he was ready for something, even if he didn't yet know what. They just rounded the bend past the shuttered bakery when Declan's nose caught it sharp, bitter, unmistakable. Smoke. Valor's head went up instantly, ears cutting the air, nostrils flaring. Then the first sound tore through the quiet, a distant shout, ragged with panic. Declan's hand went to the radio at his vest, but his eyes were already scanning over the low rooftops. A bloom of thick, black smoke unfurled from behind a row of Victorian-era houses that huddled along Riverside Street. Without a word, Declan lengthened his stride. Valor matched him, nails ticking on the sidewalk. The street ahead was chaos in miniature, people spilling out of doorways, someone waving their arms toward the east corner. "Fire! There's a fire! The house is on fire!" a man bellowed, his voice breaking. Declan's boots pounded the asphalt as they closed the distance. The smell deepened, hotter now, laced with the acrid tang of burning paint and insulation. He could feel the heat even from across the street. A woman clutched a toddler, sobbing into her phone, while another neighbor shouted instructions no one was following. Declan's gaze snapped to the house itself. 2 stories, white siding now scorched at the bottom, flames leaping in greedy tongues from shattered lower windows, climbing toward the eaves. He cut through the crowd, Valor pressing in close to his side. "Is anyone still inside?" Declan's voice was sharp, carrying over the noise. For a heartbeat, there was only the roar of the fire. Then a teenage boy, pale and wide-eyed, stammered, I think so. I heard crying. Near the kitchen. A kid." That was all Declan needed. He jerked a nod, dropped low and moved. Valor surged ahead toward the front steps, but Declan swung toward the side door. Fewer flames there. His gloved hand hit the handle. It was hot, but not yet molten. He shoved it open, smoke boiling out to wrap him in a suffocating grip. He ducked low, eyes scanning in the fractured light, lungs pulling shallow, disciplined breaths. The hallway was a tunnel of shadows, every flicker of flame along the walls a reminder that seconds mattered. A framed photograph hung askew, its glass already spiderwebbed from the heat. Declan passed it without looking, his mind mapping the layout kitchen to the left, stairs just beyond. Then Valor's bark cut through the smoke, sharp and urgent. Declan followed it, dropping to one knee to crawl under the rolling haze. Under a heavy oak table shoved against the far wall, 2 small figures were pressed together, knees drawn up, faces buried. Pink dresses, smeared with soot, clung to their thin frames. The twins, he could tell even through the smoke, were mirror images of fear, their tiny shoulders trembling. One of them peeked up, eyes glassy, mouth forming a silent plea. Valor crouched low beside them, his body angled protectively, tail a stiff line. "Hey, you're safe now," Declan said, his voice low but steady, reaching under to gather one girl into his arms. She was light as paper, the heat radiating from her skin alarming. Valor moved in as Declan backed out. The dog had been trained for this. His harness had a rescue strap. Declan clipped it gently to the other girl's dress strap, murmuring praise, and Valor reversed, dragging her clear with careful measured steps. The kitchen door frame groaned ominously. Somewhere above, a beam gave way with a crack like a rifle shot. "Move!" Declan barked, bolting for the side exit. The cool slap of evening air hit his face just as a section of the roof behind them caved in, sending up a fountain of sparks. Outside, someone screamed. Declan didn't stop until both girls were on the grass beyond the curb. He laid his own down gently, checked her breathing, then turned to unclip Valor's charge. That was when one of the girls he'd learned later her name was Amelia opened her mouth. Her voice was a whisper, raw from smoke. "Bad. Daddy." Then her eyes rolled back, and she went limp in his arms. Declan's pulse thudded in his ears, but he masked it, checking her pulse and motioning for paramedics. Behind him, Valor stood panting, smoke curling off his coat, his gaze locked on Declan as if awaiting the next command. Even as the medics swarmed, Declan's radio crackled. A colleague's voice clipped and urgent. "Hayes, we've got a possible domestic violence situation. Location not confirmed. Witness reports 2 kids might be involved." The words threaded into the chaos around him, sticking in his mind like barbed wire. He glanced at the house, now engulfed fully, and back at the girls being lifted onto stretchers. The connection was too soon to call, but something deep in his gut honed over years of seeing patterns in disorder, tightened into certainty. This wasn't over. The fluorescent hum of the Willow Creek Memorial Hospital hallway was a low, persistent note that settled into the back of Declan's mind as he stepped through the double doors toward pediatrics. It was late evening now. The last smear of sunlight had drained from the windows, leaving the building wrapped in the antiseptic hush of night. Valor patted at his side, his nails clicking on the linoleum in a rhythm so familiar it had almost become Declan's second heartbeat. The dog's coat was still faintly scented with smoke despite the quick wash down from the fire crew. A thin line of soot lingered along the edge of one ear, like a badge from the day's chaos. A young nurse in pastel scrubs light skin, mid-20s, with tired eyes framed by wire-rimmed glasses, met him at the door to room 214. Her badge read, Nurse Claire Whitmore. Claire was from one of the farming families out on the East Ridge, and she carried that steady, no-nonsense air common to people who'd been hauling their own weight since childhood. "They've been asking about the dog," she said with a faint smile, though there was a shadow under her words. "You'll need to keep your voice low. They both woke from nightmares twice already." She hesitated, then added, "Their mother's still missing. No calls, no sightings, and their biological father, no record, no contact." Declan nodded, a muscle working in his jaw. He stepped inside quietly. The room was dim, a single lamp by the bed casting a warm pool of light. On the narrow bed sat the 2 girls, Amelia and Aria Bloom, identical down to the soft wave of chestnut hair that fell to their shoulders. In the lamplight, their faces were pale but not identical in expression. Amelia's eyes, large, a shade of hazel that caught flecks of gold, watched him with cautious curiosity, while Aria's gaze was lowered, fixed on the sketch pad in her lap. Both wore simple hospital gowns, the pale fabric hanging loose over their small frames. Valor trotted forward with the slow, careful step of a dog who knew the value of gentleness. He lowered himself onto his front paws beside the bed, head tilted slightly. Amelia's hand reached out instinctively, fingers brushing over the coarse fur between his ears. Aria didn't look up, but the faintest easing of her hunched shoulders betrayed she'd noticed him. Declan saw it happen, the almost imperceptible shift when a frightened child realizes they're in the presence of something that means them no harm. On the rolling tray table lay several sheets of paper covered in crayon drawings. The top one caught Declan's eye, a crude outline of a house, its lower half filled with angry orange scribbles. In the foreground stood a man with a thick black beard, one hand holding a red and yellow stick unmistakably meant to be a lighter. Off to the side, in fainter strokes, was another figure smaller, standing apart, watching. Declan's brows drew together. "Is that your drawing?" he asked gently. Arya's crayon paused in mid-stroke, but she didn't answer. Amelia looked at him, then at the page, then back again. "We both drew it," she said in a voice just above a whisper. Her tone carried the simple, unvarnished certainty of a child telling the truth. Declan crouched to their level, his knees protesting slightly. "Can you tell me about the man with the lighter?" This time neither girl spoke, but Arya's grip on her crayon tightened until it snapped in two. Valor, sensing the change, gave a low, soft woof and rested his head on her knee. She dropped the broken crayon and buried her fingers in the fur behind his ears. He let the silence stretch, reading the room the way he might read the aftermath of a break-in, looking for what was there and what was missing. A black-bearded man, a lighter, a burning house, and someone standing apart, watching but not intervening. Pieces began to shift in his mind, aligning themselves with memories he hadn't pulled from storage in years. 8 years ago, when he'd been with the Seattle PD, he'd handled a string of suspicious fires tied to falsified insurance claims. Most had been dead ends, the arsonist disappearing before warrants could be served. And one of the names orbiting the edges of that investigation like a shadow, never quite caught in the light, was Harper Bloom. She'd been a witness in one of the claims, tangentially involved through a property she'd leased. He remembered her because she was unforgettable. He could see her now as she'd been then, mid-20s, mixed heritage with warm olive-toned skin and hair she wore in a thick braid down her back. Dark eyes quick to find the humor in a situation, but quicker to narrow when she spotted dishonesty. He'd met her only briefly, but long enough to recognize someone who didn't flinch from truth. Life had moved them apart. He'd never expected their paths to cross again, and certainly not like this. Claire returned with a small tray of juice cups, setting them down quietly. "They need rest," she murmured. Declan gave a slight nod but didn't move yet. "Any word on Harper?" he asked. Claire shook her head. "Nothing. Dispatch is still flagging her as missing. No credit card activity, no cell signal." Valor shifted position, curling up on the floor beside the bed as if settling in for a long watch. When Amelia leaned down to whisper something in his ear, nonsense words, probably he gave a slow tail thump, and she smiled faintly for the first time that night. Declan filed that away. The dog had a way of getting through where adults could not. As the girls sipped their juice, Declan stepped toward the doorway, pulling his phone from his pocket. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for Detective Monroe, an old colleague from Seattle now working interstate cases. The call connected on the second ring. "Monroe, Hayes here. We've got a house fire in Willow Creek. 2 child victims, mother missing. And I just saw a drawing that makes me think we're looking at deliberate ignition. The suspect black beard, lighter. It reminds me of the insurance arson ring we looked at back in 15. Harper Bloom's name just came up." There was a pause on the line, the kind that meant Monroe was already sifting through mental files. "Bloom? Yeah, I remember. You think this is connected?" Declan glanced back into the room. Amelia was showing Valor how to shake using a juice cup as a pretend treat. Arya was drawing again, this time a row of houses with the middle one blackened. "I don't think it," he said. "I feel it." When he ended the call, he lingered by the door for a long moment, watching the way the lamplight fell over the 3 of them, the twins and the dog as if they were a tiny island in a dark sea. He knew islands could be breached, and if what he suspected was true, the tide was already coming in. The call came in just after dawn, slicing through the thin thread of rest Declan had managed to catch in the hospital's on-call lounge. He'd been dozing in a chair, Valor curled at his feet, when the dispatcher's voice crackled through his radio. "Unit 12, we've got a possible match on the missing person Harper Bloom. Local sheriff's deputies picked her up 20 miles west, outside the Pine Hollow rest stop. She's in rough shape, requesting immediate transfer to Willow Creek Memorial." Declan was already on his feet before the transmission ended, Valor lifting his head, ears pricked forward in that alert way that meant something's moving. By the time Declan reached the emergency entrance, the county ambulance was backing in. The back doors swung open to reveal a woman slumped against the gurney's side rail, a shock blanket draped over her shoulders. Harper Bloom looked different than the memory he'd carried from 8 years ago, but the recognition was instant and absolute. Her skin, once warmed by the sun, was pale beneath streaks of soot. Her dark hair, once meticulously braided, hung loose and tangled, with threads of ash caught in the strands. There was a fading bruise along one cheekbone, and the corners of her mouth trembled, though she wasn't speaking. The paramedic briefed him in a quick, clipped tone. Female, early 30s, found wandering in a field, disoriented, signs of mild hypothermia. States she was drugged and restrained. Claims husband locked her in the trunk of a vehicle, drove her out there, then left. Name given, Colt Maddox. Declan stepped back as they wheeled her inside, his pulse quickening at the name. Colt Maddox, he'd heard it whispered in old case files, the kind of man who moved through life like a shadow that left bruises. Maddox was in his mid-40s, Caucasian, stocky build, with a deliberate, heavy gait. He'd been tied to property scams across 2 states, but never long enough to catch. The mention of him here tightened the frame around the picture Declan was building. Harper's initial exam didn't take long. Within the hour, a nurse led her, still wrapped in the blanket, down the pediatric ward hallway toward room 214. Declan hung back at the corner, Valor sitting quietly at his side, his gaze tracking the movement with that uncanny focus dogs reserve for moments that matter. Inside the room, the twins sat upright in their bed, their faces lighting with something raw and unguarded as their mother stepped in. "Mommy," Amelia breathed, and Arya followed with the same word, their voices blending into a note that seemed to shiver the air itself. Harper's knees nearly buckled, but she crossed the space in 2 uneven steps and knelt, gathering them both into her arms. The girls clung to her, burying their faces against her shoulders as though they could climb back into a world where she'd never been gone. Declan felt his throat tighten, but he stayed where he was, one hand resting lightly on Valor's neck. Some reunions didn't need an audience. Later, in a quiet conference room off the main hallway, Harper sat across from Declan, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of untouched tea. She wore fresh hospital scrubs now, but the fatigue clung to her like a second skin. Her eyes, still that deep, searching brown, were rimmed red, the aftermath of too many hours without safety. She spoke slowly at first, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd learned the hard way that telling the truth could be dangerous. "Colt was never cruel in ways you could take a picture of," she began, eyes fixed on the tea. "But he was cold. He shut doors between him and the girls, told them they were too loud, too messy. He hated them laughing. He'd push their chairs back from the table for little things, spilled milk, a question at the wrong time. After a while, they stopped trying to join us. He didn't hit them, but he didn't have to." She hesitated, her gaze flicking to Valor lying beside Declan. "He hated the dog, too. When we still lived in Ridgefield, you stopped by once with Valor, you remember? Colt told you the dog had no place in our yard. After you left, he slammed the gate so hard it splintered." Valor's ears shifted at the sound of his own name. Declan's hand slid over the dog's shoulders in a subtle reassurance. In truth, he'd noticed something yesterday that had been bothering him. In the burned-out frame of the Bloom house, Valor had lifted his nose, nostrils flaring, and given a short, sharp growl at a particular scorched doorway. Declan knew his partner's scent memory was unerring, and this morning it clicked. 3 years ago, during an animal cruelty investigation, Valor had reacted the same way at a condemned barn in Mason County. The suspect in that case had been described by smell more than sight as carrying the lingering reek of accelerant and stale tobacco. The suspect's name had been redacted from the public report, but now Declan wondered if it had been Colt all along. While Harper rested, Declan moved to the operations room, where Detective Monroe was already pulling up security feeds from traffic cams and local businesses. Monroe was in his early 50s, tall and lean, with a salt and pepper crew cut and the calm, surgical precision of a man who'd spent 3 decades in investigations. His voice carried the dry edge of someone who'd long ago traded shock for method. "I've got something," he said, gesturing Declan over. On the grainy footage from a feed near the Willow Creek Industrial Park, a man with a black beard and heavy jacket walked past a chain-link fence toward a row of storage units. The timestamp put him there less than an hour before the fire started. "Run it back," Declan said, leaning in. The man's posture was deliberate, shoulders hunched as if guarding something under his coat. In his left hand, almost hidden, was a duffel bag bulging at the sides. Monroe tapped the keyboard, freezing the frame. "Unit C-17, registered to a shell company. Guess whose signature's on the lease?" Declan's mouth tightened. "Colt Maddox." Outside, Valor shifted, his nose twitching toward the screen, as if the frozen image carried a scent only he could detect. Declan filed that away. Sometimes the dog's instincts ran ahead of the facts, and those instincts had saved lives before. Monroe straightened, his expression set. "We've got probable cause for a search. Question is, do we move now or watch him come back?" Declan's gaze stayed on the still frame, the dark blur of the duffel, the stooped shape of a man who burned bridges in the most literal way. If he's stashing evidence, every minute we wait gives him time to erase it. We move. Awana, Valor's low, steady rumble was as good as a second opinion. The gray clouds over Willow Creek had thickened by midday, flattening the light across the industrial park into a dull steel wash. Declan stood with Detective Monroe just beyond the chain-link perimeter of the storage facility, his breath visible in the cold air. Valor sat at heel, ears pivoting to catch every clang and shuffle of the tactical team moving into position. The German shepherd's amber eyes were fixed forward, the quiet readiness in his posture making him look carved from focus itself. The SWAT van's rear doors opened, and Sergeant Lena Ortiz stepped out, helmet tucked under one arm. Ortiz was in her late 30s, Latina, with a frame built from years of field work and the kind of calm authority that didn't need volume to be felt. She'd come up through border enforcement before transferring to state tactical, and she carried herself with a precision born from learning how quickly a bad read could cost lives. "Unit C-17's padlock is intact," she reported. "We'll breach on your mark." Declan and Monroe exchanged a glance. "Do it," Monroe said, voice clipped. The entry was Swift Ortiz's team cutting the lock, rolling the door up with a metallic shriek. The inside was dim, smelling faintly of mildew and something sharper beneath it, accelerant, Declan's instincts told him. As their flashlights swept the space, the contents came into focus. A low pile of new toys still in packaging, a small suitcase of children's clothes, and most damning a folder thick with forged passports and birth certificates. Declan crouched beside the suitcase, unzipping it to reveal a teddy bear still tagged with a Canadian department store's logo. "This isn't just a stash," Monroe muttered, picking up one of the fake passports. "He's staging an escape, and he's not taking the girls, he's replacing them." Before Declan could answer, Ortiz's radio crackled. "Dispatch to all units possible visual on suspect Colt Maddox, St. Clair International, Terminal B. Accompanied by unidentified female and minor child. Timestamp 2 minutes ago." Declan was already moving. "Valor, with me." The dog sprang up, muscles coiled for motion. Monroe kept pace as they headed for the unmarked sedan, waiting at the curb. The drive to St. Clair was a blur of lane changes and clipped radio chatter. Declan kept one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally reaching back to rest on Valor's harness, a silent cue they'd shared for years that meant stay sharp. The airport's afternoon rush was in full swell when they arrived. The terminal, a moving current of travelers. Declan scanned the crowd, but it was Valor who locked on first, nose lifting, body angling toward a particular stream of people near the far gates. Declan followed his lead, eyes narrowing. There Colt Maddox, heavier in the face than Declan remembered from case files. The black beard shot through with gray. He was wearing a tan coat, the brim of his baseball cap pulled low, one hand gripping the handle of a small rolling suitcase. Beside him walked a woman in her 20s with bottle blonde hair, carrying a boy of maybe 4 dark hair, wary eyes who clung to her jacket. Declan's hand went to his radio. "Visual confirmed, gate 22A, moving toward boarding queue." Monroe's voice came back immediately. "Units inbound. Don't lose him." They closed the distance, weaving through the crowd. At the top of the escalator, a sudden commotion drew Declan's eye. Two teens jostling past a small girl, knocking her toward the moving steps. In the split second before she could topple, Valor lunged sideways, planting himself against her legs and holding her upright with the weight of his body. The girl's eyes went wide, then she wrapped her arms around the dog's neck in reflex. Declan gave a sharp whistle, and Valor disengaged, trotting back to position as the girl's father rushed forward with thanks. Even in pursuit, Valor's training and instinct to protect never faltered. At the gate, boarding was already in progress. Declan's stride lengthened. "Colt!" he barked, his voice cutting through the din. Maddox's head jerked up, eyes widening before narrowing into something darker. He spun as if to retreat, but Valor was there first, moving to block the narrow path between stanchions, teeth bared in a warning snarl. Colt froze just long enough for Declan to close in, grabbing his shoulder and yanking him back from the woman and child. "Game's over," Declan said, forcing him to the ground with a controlled, practiced motion. Around them, passengers scattered back, some raising phones to film. Monroe and two uniformed officers swept in, cuffing Maddox. Even pinned, Colt managed to smirk, his voice low and venomous. "Those girls, I should have gone up in flames. Would have been cleaner." Declan's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. Monroe hauled Colt to his feet, steering him toward the concourse exit. The woman who'd been with him slipped into the crowd. The boy was taken into protective custody by airport security. Later, in the relative quiet of the terminal service corridor, Monroe handed Declan a folded printout. "Came through from the lab. DNA results on Amelia and Aria." Declan's thumb smoothed the edge of the paper before he opened it. The words were clinical, the conclusion unmistakable. Paternal match. Hayes, Declan M. He stared at it for a long moment, a flicker of 8 lost years passing through him, the letter that never arrived, the questions he'd carried without answers. He folded the page carefully, tucking it into his jacket. Valor leaned into his leg, sensing the shift in his handler's breathing. Declan scratched behind the dog's ear, a silent acknowledgement that the fight ahead had changed shape. Maddox was in custody now, but what came next for the girls, for Harper, for him, was going to require a different kind of pursuit. The courthouse in Willow Creek was a squat, red brick building with tall windows and the faint scent of old paper and polish lingering in its corridors. On a gray afternoon, Harper Bloom walked through its double doors, her dark hair tied neatly back, a navy coat draped over her frame. There was a steadiness to her step that hadn't been there weeks ago. She had healed some enough to hold her head high as she filed the petition for divorce from Colt Maddox. Her lawyer, a wiry man in his late 50s named Samuel Pratt, carried the thick folder of documentation, statements, photographs, sworn testimonies. But the page Harper signed last was the one she lingered over the most, a request for the court to recognize Declan Hayes as the legal father of Amelia and Aria. Declan had been waiting in the lobby with Valor, the German shepherd lying at his feet, his ears flicking every time the door opened. When Harper stepped out, she gave him a small nod, not victory exactly, but resolution. "It's filed," she said, voice even. Declan returned the nod. "Good. That's a start." 2 days later, in the gentle light of a late winter afternoon, they met at Willow Creek's Riverside Park. The air smelled faintly of cedar from the trees that lined the walking path, and the sky was streaked with soft blue. Amelia and Aria were chasing Valor near the gazebo, their matching pink coats bright against the grass. Declan watched them for a while, his hands in his jacket pockets before calling them over. When the girls stood before him, cheeks flushed from running, he crouched down to their level. "I want to ask you something important," he began. "Where would you like to live? With your mom? With me? Or—" He hesitated, glancing toward Harper, who stood a few steps away. Amelia looked at her sister, and Aria looked back, their eyes reflecting a silent conversation only twins seemed to share. Then in perfect unison they said, "We want both of you, and Valor too." The simplicity of it hit Declan harder than he'd expected. Behind them, Harper's eyes softened. Valor, as if understanding his name had been invoked, trotted over and pressed against the girls, letting them hold onto his neck. 1 year later, the house on Pine Hollow Road didn't look new so much as lived in. Declan had built it with help from a handful of local contractors and half the police department. Its pale siding and wide porch overlooking a garden Harper had planted herself. Inside, the living room walls were covered with framed crayon drawings, castles, rivers, stick figure families, and more than a few portraits of valor. In one corner stood a wide shelf of books and puzzles. In another, a woven basket overflowing with dog toys. The town had changed in subtle ways toward them. Valor had become something of a celebrity. His rescue work at the fire and his airport intervention had been recounted in the Willow Creek Gazette and at nearly every community gathering. That summer, during the annual Founders Day celebration, he'd been given a small medal by Mayor Evelyn Hart, a silver disc on a blue ribbon that now hung from a hook near the kitchen. Valor didn't understand the words, but he seemed to sense the pride in the way the crowd had applauded him. Declan, for his part, had joined the town's volunteer rescue unit. He wore the red and gray jacket with the reflective stripes on weekends, Valor trotting alongside with a matching vest that read, Rescue K9. They responded to everything from hikers missing on the wooded trails to flood watch along the riverbank. It wasn't police work in the strict sense, but it kept him grounded, reminded him why he'd chosen to stay in Willow Creek, rather than take a transfer to a larger city. The girls thrived in this rhythm. Harper had returned to teaching art at the elementary school, her classroom always smelling faintly of tempera paint and peppermint tea. Amelia had taken up piano, her fingers surprisingly sure for a child of 7, while Aria had a talent for sketching that mirrored her mother's. Some evenings, the four of them, 5 counting Valor, would sit in the living room, Declan reading in his chair, Harper correcting lesson plans. The girls sprawled on the floor with the dog, their laughter soft under the hum of the heater. On a bright Saturday in early spring, the living room was filled with the chatter of neighbors, relatives, and classmates. Balloons floated against the ceiling. A cake decorated with frosting flowers sat on the kitchen island. It was Amelia and Aria's 7th birthday. The guests quieted when Harper tapped her glass for attention. "The girls have something to say," she announced, her smile warm but tinged with emotion. The twins stepped up onto the low hearth, each holding one of Valor's ears for courage. Amelia started, her voice steady despite the sea of faces watching. "You're not a bad daddy." She paused, glancing at Aria, who finished the sentence with a grin. "You're our daddy." For a beat, the room was silent, the words landing like a small but perfect stone in still water. Then the applause came, gentle, warm, threaded with more than a few tears. Declan felt his throat close, but he crossed the room and scooped them both up, Valor pushing his head in under their arms, as if determined not to be left out. The girls wrapped their arms around him and the dog in the same breath, their giggles pressed against his collar. It wasn't perfection, they all knew that. There were scars that didn't show, memories that couldn't be erased. But in that moment, in the house they'd built together, the past felt like something that could finally be set down. Outside, the garden Harper had planted was beginning to bloom, daffodils and tulips turning toward the sun. In the yard, the rescue vest hung on the back porch rail, ready for the next call. Life in Willow Creek moved on, not without its challenges, but with a sense that this family, however it had been forged, was here to stay. Sometimes family is not just who you are born to, but who stands beside you through the fire and chooses to stay. Declan, Harper, Amelia, Aria, and Valor built something stronger than walls or papers could define. They built trust. They built love. They built a home. If you have ever seen loyalty change a life or watched love rebuild something broken, share your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear your story. And if this journey touched you, please like this video and follow the channel so you never miss the next story we share.